Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The high desert of Santa Fe carries a particular kind of silence. It is a place where the wind whistles through the scrub brush and the light hits the Sangre de Cristo mountains with a clarity that has drawn artists and outlaws for centuries. On October 21, 2021, that silence was broken by a single sharp crack that would echo far beyond the borders of the Bonanza Creek Ranch. It was a sound that should have been a blank, a cinematic illusion intended to punctuate a scene in a low-budget western titled Rust. Instead, it was the sound of a lead projectile tearing through the air, striking a talented young cinematographer and a director. This was not a story of a calculated killer or a premeditated plot. Today, we are dissecting the anatomy of workplace negligence. We are looking at how a series of small, seemingly minor deviations from safety protocols converged into a perfect storm of tragedy. We will examine the chain of custody for a lethal weapon, the blurred lines of responsibility on a frantic film set, and the legal precedent of holding an actor-producer criminally liable for a mistake that took a life. To understand how a live bullet ended up in a prop gun, we have to understand the environment of the Rust set. Filming a Western is an inherently grueling process. You are battling the elements, the dust, and the ticking clock of a tight budget. Rust was a passion project for Alec Baldwin, who served as both the lead actor and one of the film's producers. The production was plagued by tension from the beginning. Just hours before the shooting, several members of the camera crew had walked off the job, citing long commutes, lack of nearby housing, and most importantly, concerns over safety. There had already been 2 accidental weapon discharges on set in the days leading up to the event. In the industry, these are known as negligent discharges. They are red flags, the kind of warnings that usually lead to an immediate halt in production. But on the Rust set, the cameras kept rolling. The atmosphere was one of high pressure and cut corners. At the center of the firearms safety was a young woman named Halyna Hutchins. At 24 years old, she was the daughter of a legendary Hollywood armorer, Thel Reed. Rust was only her second job as a head armorer. She was also pulling double duty as an assistant prop master, a dual role that many industry veterans argue is a recipe for disaster. The armorer's sole focus should be the weapons. When you split that focus between sourcing period-accurate spurs and managing a live arsenal, the margins for error shrink. On the morning of October 21st, the production was already behind schedule. They were preparing to film a scene inside a small wooden structure known as the Long Church. It was a cramped space filled with crew and equipment. The weapon in question was a long Colt .45 revolver. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a replica meant to look weathered and used by Baldwin's character, Harland Rust. In the world of filmmaking, there is a very specific protocol for handling firearms. It is a rigid multi-step process designed to ensure that a live round never, under any circumstances, makes it onto a set. The armorer is supposed to show the weapon to the assistant director and the actor, demonstrating that the cylinder is empty or contains only inert dummy rounds. Dummy rounds are fake bullets that contain no gunpowder and no primer. They are there for the camera to see in the cylinder, so the gun looks loaded and realistic. They usually have a small hole drilled in the side or a loose ball bearing inside that rattles when shaken, providing a tactile and auditory confirmation that they are safe. On this day, the chain of custody broke. Halyna Hutchins brought 3 guns to the set. She reportedly left them on a rolling cart outside the church because, according to her, she was not allowed inside the building due to COVID-19 protocols, and her other duties. This left the weapons unattended for a period of time. When it came time for the rehearsal, the assistant director, David Halls, picked up the revolver from the cart. Halls would later testify that he did not thoroughly check every round in the chamber. He handed the gun to Alec Baldwin, shouting the phrase "cold gun." In the lexicon of a film set, those two words are a guarantee. They tell the actor, the crew, and the director that the weapon is completely safe to handle and point. Alec Baldwin sat on a wooden pew in the dim light of the church. He was practicing a cross-draw, pulling the revolver from a holster and pointing it toward the camera lens, where Halyna Hutchins, the cinematographer, and Joel Souza, the director, were framing the shot. Baldwin was not supposed to pull the trigger for this specific rehearsal, but he was manipulating the hammer. In his later interviews, Baldwin claimed he pulled the hammer back and released it, but never pulled the trigger. The gun, however, discharged. A live .45 caliber round exited the barrel, struck Halyna Hutchins in the chest, passed through her, and lodged in the shoulder of Joel Souza. The chaos that followed was a blur of screams and frantic calls to emergency services. Halyna Hutchins was airlifted to a hospital in Albuquerque, where she was pronounced dead. The investigation that followed was a forensic deep dive into the logistics of a film set. The first and most pressing question was the most obvious: where did the live ammunition come from? Live rounds are strictly forbidden on any professional film set. There is no reason for them to be there. Investigators found several other live rounds scattered among the dummy rounds on the prop cart and in the bandoliers worn by the actors. This pointed to a catastrophic failure in the sorting and supply process. Hannah Gutierrez-Reed would later claim that she had been provided with a box of ammunition that was supposed to be dummies, but it had been contaminated with live rounds. The supplier, a man named Seth Kenny, denied this, and the finger-pointing began a legal saga that would last years. When we look at the anatomy of this negligence, we have to look at the hierarchy of responsibility. David Halls, the assistant director, was the last line of defense before the gun reached the actor's hand. By calling out "cold gun" without personally verifying each round, he violated a fundamental safety rule. In a plea deal, Halls eventually pleaded no contest to a charge of negligent use of a deadly weapon. But the legal focus soon shifted to the armorer and the star. The prosecution's case against Hannah Gutierrez-Reed was built on the premise that she was reckless. They pointed to her lack of experience and her failure to maintain a secure chain of custody. They argued that her primary job was to ensure that no live round ever entered a weapon, and she had failed that duty in the most permanent way possible. Then there is the role of Alec Baldwin. This became the most controversial aspect of the case. Is an actor responsible for the safety of a weapon handed to them by a professional? The Screen Actors Guild and many industry professionals argued that an actor's job is to perform, and they must be able to trust the experts hired to keep them safe. However, the prosecution argued that Baldwin was not just an actor. He was a producer who helped oversee a set that was notoriously chaotic. Furthermore, they argued that as the person holding the lethal instrument, he had a basic duty of care to ensure he wasn't pointing a loaded weapon at a human being. The forensic analysis of the revolver also became a sticking point. The FBI conducted a series of tests on the firearm and concluded that the gun could not have fired without the trigger being pulled, contradicting Baldwin's public statements. The legal proceedings for Hannah Gutierrez-Reed began in early 2024. During the trial, the jury heard testimony about the disorganized state of the prop office. They saw photos of live rounds sitting in containers next to dummy rounds. The prosecution painted a picture of an armorer who was distracted and unprofessional. Her defense team tried to shift the blame to the production company for creating a high-pressure environment and to Seth Kenney for supplying the live rounds. But the jury didn't buy it. They saw the presence of live ammunition on a set as an inexcusable breach of duty. Hannah was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under New Mexico law. The case against Alec Baldwin was more fractured. Initially, charges were filed and then dropped as new evidence emerged regarding the modifications made to the gun during FBI testing. However, a grand jury later re-indicted him. His trial in July 2024 promised to be a landmark moment for Hollywood, potentially changing how liability is viewed for every performer on a set. But in a dramatic turn of events, the case was dismissed with prejudice just days into the trial. The reason was a procedural failure by the prosecution. They had withheld evidence from the defense regarding a set of bullets that had been turned over to the police, bullets that might have shed light on how live ammo ended up on set. The dismissal meant Baldwin could not be tried again for the same charges. While Baldwin walked away from the criminal charges, the anatomy of the Rust shooting remains a haunting case study in the erosion of safety standards. It revealed a culture where the drive to save money and stay on schedule outweighed the basic protocols that have kept film sets safe for decades. Since the death of Brandon Lee on the set of The Crow in 1993, the industry had operated with a sense of security that was shattered in that New Mexico church. The negligence wasn't a single act, it was a ladder of failures. It started with the hiring of an inexperienced armorer for a demanding role, continued with the decision to ignore previous accidental discharges, and ended with the failure to perform a final check of the weapon before it was fired. The impact of Halyna Hutchins' death has been profound. It sparked a massive debate over the use of real firearms in production, with many directors and actors vowing to use only airsoft guns or rubber props, adding flashes and recoil in post-production. It forced a reckoning with the power dynamics on set, where crew members often feel they cannot speak up about safety concerns for fear of being blacklisted. The civil lawsuits filed by the Hutchins family were settled, but the emotional cost remains immeasurable. Halyna was a rising star, a mother, and a wife whose life was cut short because the environment she worked in failed to value her safety over the shot. When we dissect this case, we see that negligence is rarely a bolt from the blue. It is a slow accumulation of small risks. It is the armorer who is too busy to check the box. It is the assistant director who is too rushed to look at the cylinder. It is the producer who ignores the complaints of the crew. In the Long Church at Bonanza Creek Ranch, all those small risks finally met a live round. The anatomy of this crime is not found in a motive of malice, but in the silence of protocols that went ignored until it was too late. The legacy of Rust is a permanent stain on the industry, a reminder that in the world of make-believe, the stakes are still very much real. The lead bullet that killed Halyna Hutchins didn't just end a life, it punctured the illusion that Hollywood is a place where the magic of the screen is protected by an invisible wall of safety. We are left with the image of a quiet church in the desert, a place meant for peace that became the site of a tragedy born of purely human error. The true horror of the Rust shooting lies in its avoidable nature. Every protocol that was bypassed was put in place specifically to prevent this exact outcome. When the desire to finish a scene or save a few dollars on the budget becomes more important than the mechanical reality of a loaded gun, the result is never just a mistake. It is a betrayal of the collective trust required to create art. In the end, The most dangerous thing on that set wasn't the gun itself, but the belief that the rules didn't apply as long as the cameras were rolling. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.